Hey y'all, hi. I am here today to deliver one of my patented thorough reviews. I'm going to be reviewing the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette from soup to nuts. It made it sound like that's the subtitle of the palette. Moonlit Seduction from soup to nuts. And you know, I feel like if there is going to be a moonlight seduction, it should be from soup to nuts. Like if someone's gonna seduce me by moonlight, do a thorough job of it, you know? Anyway, first things first, this is a collab of sorts in that my friend Becca Sun and I decided to review this palette together not together, I mean, she's not here, but we are both reviewing the palette, each on our own YouTube channel, and we're posting the videos on the same day. We made like a review pact. And honestly, she helped me decide to review this palette, to just give the people what they want, which is reviews of Pat McGrath palettes. And I'm really glad I decided to do that. And I'm really excited to watch her review. So of course, I will link Becca's review in the description box down below. Becca is also an absolute delight, and I really recommend subscribing to her YouTube channel, especially if you're subscribed to my channel. And part of the reason you watch me is that you like kind of calm, considered, thoughtful beauty content, because she's very that. So without further ado, because this is going to be a long video, I'm going to break it down for you so that you'll be able to navigate through the video if you just want to see some of what I have to offer and not plod through every single aspect of this very thorough review just to get the nuggets of wisdom for which you have clicked. First, I'm going to give you my general knowledge about the Pat McGrath eyeshadow formula based on my experience with my other Pat McGrath palette. I have one other, and reviewing that palette, I learned a lot about the Mothership palettes at large, their formulas, the packaging, etc., etc. Then I'm going to move into talking about the eyeshadows in this palette, Moonlit Seduction, and what they look like in person. So I'll talk about what the textures are like in person, what the colors are like in person, and that's when I'll be giving you really, really good, detailed, close-up swatches of Moonlit Seduction. I will also talk about how the colors and textures compare to Midnight Sun, and I will be giving you swatch comparisons between key shades in this palette and comparable shades in my existing eyeshadow collection. Then I will talk about the color story, what it looks like in person, how it strikes the eye, how it unfolds with use, and what kind of looks it leads one to do. From there, I will segue into a demonstration of how these eyeshadows apply to the eyes. So I filmed myself applying this eye look very close up today, and I'll roll that footage and I'll talk you through what I did to get my eyes to look like this using Moonlit Seduction. It's actually called Moonlit Seduction. I've been saying it wrong this whole entire time, and I may continue to say it wrong, just warning you. The last bit of the video will be my final thoughts. I've had this palette for almost a month now, and I've used it a lot, so I have very fully formed thoughts and opinions about it as a piece of makeup in the makeup world and in a person's makeup collection. If this is your first time watching me, then I hope you'll subscribe. I make thoughtful beauty content. Sometimes I do deep dive reviews. Sometimes I talk more existentially about beauty. And whatever I do, I try to stay grounded in reality and not to promote overspending. And with that, let us get into the meat of the video. So section number 1 of the video, general knowledge about the Pat McGrath formula based on my experience with my other Pat McGrath palette, Midnight Sun. I will, of course, link my super thorough review of that palette below this video. So if you really want the full and complete experience, then you can click through and watch that video, which is what I'm about to summarize, basically. I learned that the packaging is the height of opulence. It really is as lovely as it seems like it will be. Heavy, sleek, delicious. I learned that the famous Pat McGrath special shades, those baked shades, aren't what I thought they would be before I had them in my hands. They're not creamy. They feel kind of scratchy to the touch at first, but then they smooth over and they do apply smooth, kind of dry and smooth. I didn't think that I would like that, but I ended up loving it because I found that basically more glitter and less goop, like more micas in those special shades and less interstitial matter makes them less creasy and slidey on the lids and easier to build. And it makes them work way better with a brush than with a finger, which is really different from all of the other really creamy, crushy special shades in my eyeshadow collection. Those baked special shades are different. I always use a brush to apply them. I usually use my fingers a lot when I'm applying eyeshadow, but not with Pat McGrath. All of the formulas, the mattes, the metallics, and the special shades are designed for precision work with a brush, and when I use them that way, they're just effortless. Speaking of the metallic formula, so not the special shades, but just the regular metallic, one of the things I learned from that palette, that initial review, is that that metallic formula is, I think, the best on the market. Truly extraordinary, in my opinion, because they're so finely milled. Finely milled, but again, not pumped full of filler. The mattes are, of course, also really pigmented and easy to manipulate. So that's it in a nutshell when it comes to everything I've ever known about Pat McGrath Mothership palettes before the day that this arrived in the mail. And the big question was, and the big question that I'm about to answer is, what are these eyeshadows like in person in the context of that information? Is there anything different about them? Anything surprising about them? In what way do they align with what I already knew to be true and therefore what I expected? And in what way, if any, do they depart from what I expected? Starting with the formulas, and this is actually where the biggest surprise lies in this palette if you're coming to it with pre-existing information about Pat McGrath Mothership palettes. The matte shadows in this palette are the same formula, the same wonderful, easy to control, super pigmented matte formula as Midnight Sun. The metallics in this palette are the same incredible metallic formula, love it so much. But the 4 special shades are not the same as Midnight Sun. They aren't the traditional Pat McGrath special shades. They're not baked. They're just regular shiny eyeshadows pressed into pans. They don't have that scratchy, sort of floofy, poured and set feel that turns into something smooth when you put your finger across it. They are not like a lightweight packed mica. They do have a bit of a goopy interstitial matter in them, that sort of slick carrier, like base for the micas to be suspended in, the micas and the pigments, very like other special eyeshadows that are super shiny and gratifying to work with. So very much like the Cliona Glitter Multichrome formula, very much like Natasha Denona Cava and Natasha Denona Sparks from the Gold palette. I do feel like, for example, the gold in here, I would say that it has shot to the top of the list of eyeshadows that I use in that way and for that purpose, because it is a really exquisite specimen of its kind. It's flaky and shiny and sheer and wet look and absolutely perfect. It's one of the shadows that I have on my eyes today, and when I put it on in that demonstration footage later in the video, you'll see that. You'll see that it's exquisite, you know? It's just perfect for what it is. And I would say that's true of all 4 of these, but they're not as interesting as the special shades. None of these has that distinctiveness of the equivalent shade in the Midnight Sun palette, because they just feel like really, really, really good versions of a thing that I already have a lot of. And for me, as somebody who doesn't like to have excess, like doesn't like to have too much of the same thing, it means that they just don't excite me as much as they would have excited me if they were these same 4 colors, but in that baked formula. So the shock of the video finally out of the way, let's dig into talking about the colors and how they look in person. I'll show you the close-up swatches and you'll be able to see that they are absolutely beautiful. I mean, I expected nothing less, but you know, there's not a one of them that underperforms or gives a disappointing swatch or looks wildly different in person than I thought that it would. These are luxury eyeshadows designed by one of the greatest makeup artists of our day, if not the greatest. So of course, they're great. So let us get into the nitty-gritty and compare some of these shades to some of the colors in Midnight Sun. Because I already have a Pat McGrath Mothership, I wanted to know if there would be any repeats, because it kind of looks like there would be, right? The dark matte in the bottom left-hand corner and the champagne shade in the upper left-hand corner shimmer. Both of those look like they could have just put the same color in each of these two palettes when you're looking at the online swatches. So I really wanted to compare key shades to key shades between these two palettes. I'll roll that footage now, and I think you'll be able to see that they aren't the same. There aren't any exact repeats. Overall, I feel like this is a bit of a lighter palette than Midnight Sun, or a bit of a weaker palette, you could say. The colors that look similar in Midnight Sun, they're just darker and pack more of a punch. It's a really deep, saturated, pigmented palette. And of course, these are very, very pigmented. It's just that the color of each of the pigments in the shadows that have a comp in Midnight Sun, the color is a bit lighter, a bit more watercolory overall. And there's something to be said for that when it comes to ease of use, which I'll talk about later in the video. For me, I'm really attracted to that intensity, that punch of pigment. And so for me, that is a vote in favor of Midnight Sun. More than anything, though, I was relieved to find that there were no exact repeat shades. From there, when I was swatching this palette up close, I went on to compare key shades, like really intriguing shades from this palette, to other eyeshadows in my collection. Curiously, that rose gold, this is kind of a side note, it is the one that feels to the touch the most like the kind of flaky, slightly scratchy, or initially slightly scratchy baked formula. It really has that feeling when you first touch it, and then it becomes smooth. But it's kind of the one with the densest underpigment. It's the one that I would be the least likely to use as like a sheer wash all over the lids. It kind of feels more like a metallic and less like a really spectacular dynamic layering shade. Color-wise, nothing really stuck out to me in my existing collection as a dupe for this. I think that's partly because when you swatch it, it really just swatches as a metallic pink. I do have metallic pinks, but it just didn't feel like there was anything to be interested in when it came to the nuances between colors in that color category in my collection. So I just swatched and compared the other three. Starting with the gold, you can see how this compares to other similar shades that I've already talked about. So Natasha Denona Cava, the Topper and the Tom Ford quad. And you can see that it's really, really sheer, shiny, wet look, and totally alive. It's beautiful. I also did color comparisons with this kind of silver, blue shifting white sheer shade to other shades that I thought might inform you of something when you see them next to it. And the most extensive swatch comparison that I did here was of this sort of blue-brown pigment shade in Pat Mcgrath Moonlit Seduction. I know that some of you out there are really curious about how it compares to other shades similar to it. And you'll be able to see that it is a very, very close match for one of the Cliona glitter multi-chromes. And really similar in function to a handful of the Cliona glitter multi-chromes. I mean, it does what many of them do, or I guess you could say many of them do almost exactly what it does. And one of them pretty much does do exactly what it does. I tried to make it clear when I was swatching overhead which eyeshadows that I was swatching, so you can see what I'm comparing these shades to, but I will also put that information in the description box under this video so you can double check and be sure. Other than those special shades, the only one that I really wanted to compare extensively was the bronze. I have an interest in bronze, golden bronze and bronzy gold. I'm always looking for one that doesn't really lean copper. This one leans a little more orange than I wish it did. Same is true with the one in Midnight Sun. They just both lean a little more orange than I wish they did. And to kind of show that to you, to really reveal its undertones, I swatched it next to all of the metallic bronzes in the Natasha Denona gold palette. I hope that the swatches have shown you that what this turned out to be in person is a group of colors and textures of eyeshadow that I kind of already have scattered throughout my collection, and just a really good version of each one of them. But nothing color-wise or formula-wise that's totally unique, except for maybe this top center shade, this sort of like metallic platinum, like slightly sparkly metallic platinum. I didn't really have anything else like it when I went to try to swatch it and compare it to things. It excites me a lot. It was actually possibly the thing that made me the most interested in this palette. And yeah, the cheese does kind of stand alone when it comes to that color. But other than that, we're basically dealing with Pat McGrath level versions of things that aren't new to me. Whether that's like a palette that's worth it, I mean, that's a very individual thing. I would say whether that is something that excites me and that's going to continue to excite me, and whether you can infer that that's something that would excite you and continue to excite you and therefore potentially be worth it. I feel like that actually depends on the next thing I'm going to talk about, the next section of the video, which is about color story. Because if all of these are just really good versions of something that I already have pretty decent versions of, then the question becomes, is there value added in having them all together in one beautiful palette so that they constantly inform each other when I'm working with the palette? Instead of having like this color story dismantled and scattered among different palettes or among palettes of singles. So let's talk about that now. Section 3 of the video, the color story. Here's what I'll say. Well, I have a lot to say. Here's the first thing I'll say. I was intrigued by this palette when I filmed New Makeup Releases Hot Takes and it had been announced. The color story looked really promising to me. And the moment kind of passed, you know, I wasn't going to buy it with my own money and I hadn't really fully decided if it was worth committing part of my budget for self-sponsored review. And then when I was talking with Becca and we kind of egged each other on and cooked up the idea to do this collab review, I decided to actually review it. When I got it in the mail and I opened it up full of anticipation, I was disappointed by the way that the color story looked. In person, it just looked kind of humdrum to me. I opened it up and I looked at it and my heart sank and I was like, oh, it just looks like mauve mattes and some shiny silvers and golds. And I mean, I don't know what I was expecting because it's not as though the color story looked dramatically different in person. None of the individual shadows look different in person. I think I just experienced that moment of having built up like a fantasy of this palette and what it would offer to me, and then receiving it in the mail, opening it up and being like, oh, it's just eyeshadow. So that happened and I wanted to tell you about that. I think that it looks in person maybe like a little bit repetitive. I don't know. It just doesn't look dynamic. It looks kind of like it could be a one-trick pony. And it also doesn't look particularly original. If you remove the excitement of the quality of the shadows, just how beautifully I know that they're going to perform, and you remove the excitement. I mean, the palette has already removed from itself the excitement about the special shades because it doesn't have the actual baked special shades. So if you remove those qualities, you're left with a pretty common color story for eyeshadow palettes. And I think that I was really struck by that when I opened it up. However, it really came through and kind of opened itself up to me, the color story, in use as I started to use it. It kind of did the opposite of what Midnight Sun did. And I went deeply into the color story of Midnight Sun in that other review, the review of Midnight Sun. I talked about the fact that I was really intrigued by the color story, which is so dynamic and sort of strange and original, for really years before I bought the palette. I mean, I think there were years that elapsed in between when it launched and when I bought it, maybe a year and a half, maybe even more. And I was intrigued that entire time specifically by the color story. Then I got Midnight Sun and I started using it and I found the color story really difficult, a tough nut to crack, right? It just didn't offer me very many combinations of layers. And I found myself using only one or two shadows at a time. I do use Midnight Sun a lot, but I tend to just use one or two eyeshadows at a time. I almost use it as though it's just a collection of singles. And there are some eyeshadows in that palette. There's like more than one eyeshadow in that palette that I don't really feel like has best friends in the palette. And if I use only that palette, once I get beyond like the second or third color, if I start trying to get creative, it usually just gets a little bit muddy and discordant. With this, the exact opposite is true. All of the colors are friends with all of the other colors. Every color has 3 or 4 or 5 other eyeshadows just crying out to be used with it. They all look beautiful together. They all sing together. And it's like any combination of any of these colors gets you a beautiful look. Some of them end up being kind of similar to each other, but you can make them quite different if you try, to a degree, not as different as all the different looks you can get from Midnight Sun. I think most notably with this, you can get a very, very, very cool toned look, which kind of did surprise me, how extremely extremely cool toned this platinum shade is and how softly cool toned the dark brown is, you can get like a straight up old school cool toned smoky eye, kind of like a early 2000s style cool toned smoky eye, very, very recent vintage glam. You can totally get that with this. And you can get these sort of warm, mauvey, bronzy, like rainbow spill looks. A million variations on that theme very easily. So I'm going to show you the swatch footage of me grouping colors together to kind of show you which looks I've been making with this palette. And you'll see that you can either choose an overall cool story, right? An overall cool look, as I was just saying, by omitting the golds and pinks. But beyond that, it is truly just variations on the theme, which it just makes it a more homogeneous palette overall. You get a bunch of looks that look slightly different from each other, but not dramatically different. There isn't, again, that dramatic diversity of looks that you can get with Midnight Sun. It's just not here. But there's an upside to this because it makes it really user-friendly, really easy to work with, and amazing for layering watercolory looks, which is something that I love. I love a layered watercolory look. It's wildly easy to work with almost any combination of shadows from this palette. You can add almost any other shadow from the palette and it'll work. It's so easy to play with it and have a flawless result. Because if you're already working with 2 or 3 shadows and then you just randomly pick a 4th one or a 5th one, it's going to work. You can't mess it up. And with any combination of eyeshadows, any look that you might be building from this palette, adding this really dynamic blue-brown pigment or kind of like blue-red pigment, VR Sextasy is the name of that eyeshadow, adding VR Sextasy to the center of the lid on top of any look with this palette, it just makes the look suddenly beyond. Like it just takes it over the edge, lights it up, and it's always spectacular. It's difficult for me. It has been difficult for me testing this palette not to finish absolutely every look with a dab of VR Sextasy in the middle of the lids. And if you really love this, I actually kind of went easy on VR Sextasy today because I didn't want it to totally overwhelm the look, but it is there. And if that glossy, kind of like multichromatic oil spill eye look, like oil spill grungy eye look, if that's something that you've been wanting to figure out how to do for years, and you just don't have any eyeshadow that does that, and you feel like you can't get enough of that kind of thing, then that might be something in this palette's favor because it's that across the board, right? However, if you already have a Cleona shadow that does something similar, or if you prefer your palettes to be more dynamic, to offer you more of a diversity of looks, then just be aware that the downside of the fact that adding VR Sextasy on top of any look with this palette makes it spectacular, the downside of that is that doing that also kind of makes each look that you do that with look a lot like the other look that you do that with. So that's the story on the color story. Possibly the greatest upside of the color story is that you have a solid group of shadows with which to make cool toned looks and a solid group of shadows with which to make warm toned looks. And possibly the greatest downside is that it's easy to end up with a bunch of looks that almost all look the same, especially if you're mixing them all together instead of leaning hard into the cool tones sometimes and hard into the warm tones other times. Now I'm going to talk through this look. So we've moved into section 4 of the video. I'm going to roll the footage of me applying the look that I'm wearing today. I kind of mixed cool and warm a little bit, but I tried to keep it a little bit on the cool side because I feel like the cool toned oil spilly look is one of the most unique things that this palette does. And I also tried not to go too contrasty. That's usually what I do. I usually layer in more darks in the corners and kind of more bright on the lid. I tried to leave it a little watercolory because again, I feel like that is kind of like a hallmark of what this palette can do. So I started with the beautiful platinum and going in with a brush, which is what I always do with metallics with this formula. Usually I'd use my finger, but for Pat McGrath I use a brush. I put it right in the middle of the lid, just where I wanted it to go. As ever, it is so easy, exquisitely easy to work with these eyeshadows. I only put the shadow where I wanted it to go, very delicately placed it, and it blended perfectly, and I easily got the shape that I wanted on the lid, on both lids, with that color. I also put it on my lower lash line. I went into the dark brown matte, which I almost always use when I'm using this palette, and I just used it to put some darkness in the outer corner and give my eyes some dimension. So I packed it into the outer corner, buffed it out with a fluffier brush, and I also put some of it on my lower lash line. I love working with Pat McGrath mattes in this capacity. I feel like they provide the depth that I want, but I never end up accidentally with like black eyeshadow everywhere. It just feels like they always do exactly what I want. So then I went in with a shiny sheer gold. It's one of my favorite kinds of eyeshadows. Again, to me, this is the new Natasha Denona Cava, and I'm going to be using this in that role, I think, going forward. Because these are kind of creamier and more run-of-the-mill textured shades, they have a little bit more of that medium in them holding the micas together. I have found that this is just as easy to use with a finger as it is with a brush. Unlike all of the other Pat McGrath eyeshadows, these 4 special shades are actually pretty great with a finger. But I applied this one in both ways that you could see how it looks swept all over an existing eye look, all over the brow bone and almost all over every part of the look with a brush. And then I also packed a little bit of it into the inner corner of each of my eyes on the lid, like the inner part of each lid with a finger, so you could see how that would look. Really, really shiny, really pretty. And of course, I finished off this look by tapping a little bit of that Extraordinary Oil Spill eyeshadow VR Sextasy into the center of each lid. And as it always does, it blended beautifully with all of the other shadows, kind of lit them up, melted into the existing eye look and made it just feel more nuanced, more intriguing, but without taking away kind of the existing grungy quality. And because it shifts both blue and red, it's kind of the ultimate could go either way when it comes to cool tones and warm tones, right? It's both cool toned and warm toned. So it makes sense that it would work as a topper for any look that you might create with this palette. I like the look. Again, it's a little bit more of a light touch than I would usually do, but this is classic. Like this is exactly the kind of look that I've ended up with most days when I've used this palette, unless I've made an extreme effort to get something super different. If I had used the coppery bronze as a base instead of the platinum, it would be just like this, but it wouldn't be cool toned. It would be like this exact look, but with a little bit of a different filter on it, you know? And of course, if I had incorporated one of those mauve-y, sunset-y mattes, it would look a little bit more colorful, a little bit more sunset-y. But this look is an extremely good representation of what this palette has been leading me to do almost every time. Okay, section 5 of the video and the last, final thoughts. And I've written a couple of questions down to help me wrangle my final thoughts and clarify them to you. Question 1, did anything about this palette surprise me? Yes, the fact that the special shades aren't the special shades. I mean, that's the biggest surprise of all, goofed and gagged. And once I figured that out, I would say that the fact that they work well with fingers, like maybe even better with fingers than with a brush for some applications, that also surprised me because none of the other Pat McGrath eyeshadows that I've used have been like that. Color-wise, I think the thing that surprised me about this is how easy it is to get a really cool toned glam. I feel like that's not quite what we're seeing in advertising for this palette. It doesn't really tell you that when you look at the color story, but when you start working with it, it emerges right away. Next question, do I like it better than Midnight Sun? This is kind of hard. This might surprise you, but it's hard for me to answer. I think that ultimately at the end of the day, no. I don't like it better than Midnight Sun for one reason only, and that's the fact that there aren't any baked shades in it. And actually the weaker kind of saturation of some of them, especially the dark matte. I like that really dark, super, almost gray toned, like cool neutral matte that's in this position in Midnight Sun better than this one. This lends itself to, again, more watercolory smoky looks, and I just love having that punch of pigment. So for those two reasons, ultimately, Midnight Sun wins out for me. But I do like the cohesion. I like the ease of use with this. I love using it, and I actually think that I love the end result of me using this palette more than I like the end result of me using the Midnight Sun palette. So that makes it sort of silly and arbitrary that I would say that I like Midnight Sun better. I think I like Midnight Sun better as a connoisseur of makeup, right? Or a sort of semi-collector, because it feels more like a real example of what Pat McGrath is known for. And so I cherish it more because of that. But in use, in practice, I have to be honest, I've loved using this palette, and I've loved the looks that I've gotten. I feel like they end up kind of walking that line between glam and grungy. Or not glam, because I feel like glam implies a kind of put together quality. I feel like they are artistic. The looks end up looking artistic and grungy, but there's a lightness about them. And I don't know, it's been a real pleasure to work with it. It has disappointed me a little bit in its lack of dynamism, in its homogeny, but it is that very quality that has led me to be so excited to work with it every day, and that's made me so happy with the look that I've ended up with. So go figure. Okay, third question. Who is it potentially for? I mean, I hope I've given you a lot of evidence, a lot of data, so that you can decide for yourself. If this is in your budget, if you have room in your life for more eyeshadow, you can decide for yourself based on what I've shown you and what I've said, whether or not this is going to be a good buy for you. If it's not in your budget, don't worry about it. Again, there's a chance you could dupe the vibes pretty easily. You don't even need this many eyeshadows to do it, right? You could probably collect like 5 singles from your collection and dupe the vibes of almost every eye look that I've gotten from this. But I could see it being like the one palette to rule them all for someone who likes dreamy, watercolory, artistic, wet look lids that lean bronzy mauve, who prefers a truly neutral dark matte, and who loves a blue-brown pigment with a red undertone, and appreciates the option of cool toned shadows, right? The option to do a cool toned look, or the kind of balance, layered excitement and balance that you can get from using cool tones and warm tones together, kind of like I did today. So if I just described you and you, again, have the budget for this, which is a big if, it's a very, very expensive eyeshadow palette. And again, it's like really useful, but not earth-shattering, like a really good version of what it is, but what it is isn't groundbreaking. I started a sentence and I lost the syntax. If I just described you, and if you have it in your budget, blah, 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 which is a big if, blah, 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 you probably won't be disappointed if you decide to buy it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Especially if you go into it open-eyed, knowing that you're not getting any of those unique baked shades. So in a nutshell, I honestly love using it, but I don't think that it stands apart from other things on the market like it in the way that other motherships do stand apart from other things on the market that are in any way like them. So I would say it's easy to love as a tool. It's easy to love as a piece of makeup, but harder to love as like a collector's piece, you know, which I feel like for some people, especially when it comes to Pat McGrath, that's what they're after. So if that's what you would be after with this, I'm glad that I was able to give you the information that will help you take a deep breath and take a step back. And that is it. Goodness gracious. What a doozy. I'm really interested in seeing what Becca has to say about this, because she has a lot more Pat McGrath palettes than I do. She is kind of a collector. And so I feel like we're really maybe reviewing the palette from different angles. Let's all go watch Becca's video together, shall we? And don't forget to subscribe if you've been watching me and you think you'd like to be subscribed. Thank you all so much for watching. And don't forget to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.